Manhattan in the 1800s was a crime-infested hellhole. If anyone was to expose the seedy goings-on in this underworld to the wider public, a fearless investigative journalist was required. There was such a man, and his name was Arthur Pember, an Englishman who ventured into New York's criminal underworld to expose crime and corruption. Born in Lambeth, London, in 1835 to wealthy middle-class parents, Arthur Pember was educated at Oxford and went on to become a barrister. It's a really interesting piece of trivia that Pember was responsible, in part, for the foundation of the Football Association, soccer, in 1863. When he represented the local club he played for at the FA's first meeting on 26th of October that year. In fact, he was elected its first president. In 1868 he emigrated to America with his family to begin a career as a journalist and found work with the New York Tribune. In a city pretty much still in the gangs of New York era, he began investigative work to expose crime and prostitution in the city's panel houses, going to great lengths to uncover corruption, even to the extent of assuming disguises, such as a street beggar, to walk unnoticed in the slums around Water Street. Today, you will hear Pember's account of his journey into Water Street at night in the company of a police detective, a street which had a notorious reputation for crime and debauchery. You will discover the story of some of the city's most infamous characters of the time, including Tommy Haddon, owner of dive bars and a well-known operator in shanghaiing, and Kit Burns, a saloon keeper who ran bare-knuckle boxing prize fights, rat-baiting, and dog fights. This is the story of New York's underworld after dark. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us to continue bringing the past alive. When is a man not a man? When is a woman not a woman? When they dwell in Water Street, New York. This is a novel answer to a very old conundrum, but unlike its predecessors, it is intended by no means to be a factious one. On the contrary, it is intended to convey a sad truth in plain, sober language. To those of you who may be inclined to dispute this proposition, I say, go and see these places. Study the phases of human, or rather inhuman, life to be witnessed any and every day in the purlieus of Water Street. And then consciously say whether you think it's possible for a man to remain a man, or for a woman to remain a woman, when subjected to the evil influences of that infamous locality. The neighbourhood of Water Street is about the most notorious in the metropolis for deeds of violence, flagrant vice and scenes of debauchery. It abounds in lodging houses for sailors, liquor stores of the lowest class without a number, dance houses and concert saloons, at the very thought of which poor decency hides her eyes in agony, and various other low places of amusement. Brothels of the worst description swarm in all directions, the wretched half-drunken, shameless inmates being permitted by the police to flaunt their sin and finery and ply their hateful trade openly, by day or night, without let or hindrance. The mixture and recklessness of vice, the unblushing effrontery with which it is carried on, the barefaced employment of women to entrap sailors, and the apparent carelessness or interestedness of the authorities in not suppressing these resorts, is a standing disgrace to the city of New York. The infamous proprietors of these dance and sailors' lodging houses seem to consider that a staff of prostitutes is a necessary part of their stock in trade, a stock, if anything, more remunerative than the sale of their villainous whiskey. At night, the quarrels, fights, and noisy disturbances make the darkness hideous, and are of such frequency that none can hope for a night's rest until they have been inured by habit to the ways and doings of this terrestrial pandemonium. Fights and desperate encounters among intoxicated men and women occur night after night, and are looked upon as a regular part of the 24 hours programme. Sailors, canalmen, dockmen, and landsmen are continually fighting about the women who are attachés to these establishments, and it is only too common to see the most desperate encounters between the women themselves, who become perfect demons under such circumstances, and to see the lookers-on encourage the combatants instead of separating them, These wretched creatures have arrived at such a pass that they are actually compelled to madden themselves with drink in order to become sufficiently immoral and disgusting. The use of deadly weapons, too, is so common that murder provokes no sentiment of horror among the denizens of Water Street, but only excites in them a morbid curiosity to see the murderer, as he is, hurried off to jail by the police, if they know him, to shake him by the hand, and, if possible, to catch a glimpse of the murdered man. And, if they have homes, what are they? The men, too, often confirmed drunkards, and consequently continually out of work, and unable to support their families honestly. The women, oh horrible thought, earning the wages of sin with the consent of their husbands. The children literally brought up in the gutter, clothes, furniture, bedding, all gone to the pawn shop. The whole family huddled together at night on a dirty husk or straw mattress, or on the bare boards in one ill-built, badly ventilated, and filthy room where any pretense of decency is impossible. What is the inevitable result? The men and women only care for their daily allowance of rum, no matter how obtained. The boys are all thieves at 10 years of age. At 14, the girls are all prostitutes. In such a neighbours it is not to be expected that any person of respectability will reside. So, with the exception of a very few professional men, such as doctors and others, whose ties confine them to the spot, these disciples of vice and immorality have it all to themselves. How many men have been fortunately kept from the commission of sin and crime by the want of opportunity? But in this spot, that devil, opportunity, is ready-made to hand. One night I walked into the Oak Street station house and asked the captain of the 4th Precinct to allow one of his detectives to escort me through these terrible slums. The captain received me most courteously and immediately told of an experienced man to accompany and protect me. A man, he said, whose especial duty it is to look after these dens of vice and immorality, and who will show you some sights that will make your hair stand on end, though, he added, things have improved a little of late, in consequence of the business. What a business! What a business! Being so blown upon. I was treated to a spice of Water Street life while awaiting in the station house. For the few preparations the detective thought it necessary to make, the inspector on duty was hearing a charge brought by a fine-looking young sailor of the United States Navy against a boarding-house crimp for assault. It appeared that the crimp had been endeavouring to fleece the sailor, and, finding that his rapacious demands were not likely to be complied with, had coolly knocked him down and then brutally stamped his left eye out with the heel of his boot. At this moment a poorly clad, wretched-looking woman entered the station house and, in nervous, agitated tones, charged her husband, who she asserted had a considerable sum of money about him, with refusing to give her the means of obtaining the necessaries of life. After much mutual recrimination, the inspector ordered the man to be searched. This was done most rigidly, but nothing was found in his many mysteriously placed pockets. On unlacing his boots, however, $100 in bills was unearthed from one, and $110 in gold from the other. But the detective was now ready, and, wishing the captain good evening, I started to do the slums of Water Street after dark, and study the abyss of degradation into which it is possible for poor humanity to fall. As we left the station house, I inquired of the detective whether this neighbourhood was more densely populated than other parts of the city. I soon received an affirmative answer of the most practical kind, for we were close to the entrances of 2 perfect hives of humanity in Cherry Street, known as single and double alleys. Each of these alleys is a single tenement house. Single alley, so called because it has only one face, is capable of holding, not accommodating, about 70 families. Double alley, which has 2 faces and 2 entrances, will hold almost 140 families. Many of these families, which average 5 in number, take in lodgers and boarders. On this occasion, a tolerable degree of peace and quietness reigned throughout these dark and dingy buildings, but they are often the theatre of most fearful scenes. These 2 enormous tenement houses are only about 7 or 8 feet apart. Consequently, when a drunken fight takes place between its inhabitants and the police, it is a very serious affair. Even in the winter, the odours from its gutters are anything but pleasant. What must they then be in the summer-time? 2 years ago, the authorities compelled the owners of these tenement houses to shut them up for a while and render them more fit for human habitation. At the corner of Cherry and Water Streets, we met a veteran female candidate for admission into the inebriate asylum. She was at least 55 years of age and bore on her face all the marks of 40 years' war with whiskey. Her face was bespattered with mud. Her hair streamed in all directions. Her tattered bonnet hung down on her back, only prevented from falling by the twisted knot in which the strings had become entangled. Shoeless, stockingless, she hung with one arm lovingly entwined round the lamp-post. The other was solemnly beating time to her maudlin music. She was evidently the imaginary victim of misplaced attachment to some gay Lothario. Sublimely innocent of the original tune, she chanted to a sort of low dirge and well-known old French ballad. They marched through the town with their banners so gay. As we passed her, she had just reached the chorus and was declaiming with drunken emphasis, "And she caption wish she whiskers core is shy glanchy o' me." Poor captain! He little knew of the devoted love so ardently burning for him in that rum-sodden bosom. As she stood there, the gaslight throwing a ghastly glare on her face, she looked for all in the world like one of the witches in Macbeth. Leaving this poor victim of whiskey, we passed along Water Street, and opening the door of one of the more quiet-looking houses, we found ourselves in the presence of Tommy Haddon, a little sharp-faced man with a restless, wandering eye. He was seated at his business desk, absorbed, as he told us, in calculating how much he could afford to give for a house of a similar character to his own, which is now for sale a little higher up the street. Tommy is a decided money-maker, and prides himself considerably on his financial abilities. Unless his looks very much belie him, he is certainly one of the hardest and worst of the Water Street notorieties. His occupation consists in boarding sailors, which implies fleecing them, and in providing captains of ships with a man or two when they are unable to make up their full complement of sailors, which means shanghaiing them. His plan of operations is this. One of the numerous runners he employs contrives to fasten himself on some unsuspecting fellow, of course a stranger, who is the worse for liquor, and, good-naturedly proposing to stand him a drink, lands him, with a gentle air of accident, at Tommy Haddon's. The poor fellow's drink is drugged. He soon becomes insensible, and is quietly put away upstairs till a convenient opportunity arises for smuggling him on board ship. The victim, on coming to his senses, finds to his horror and amazement that he is at sea, out of sight of land, and that he has no alternative but to work before the mast on a voyage to China or Australia. By the time the return voyage is ended, it often happens that men have become reconciled to, or have even learned to like, their new mode of life, and, after a run ashore and spending all their money in Water Street, they will ship themselves of their own accord for another voyage. Tommy Haddon is now serving out a sentence of 10 years in the state prison for shanghaiing a sailor. While talking to Haddon at his door, we suddenly heard piercing screams coming from a neighbouring alley. Our detective, placing his hand to his ear, listened for one moment to catch the exact direction from which the screams came. "This way, sir, this way," he exclaimed, and we started at a run. A minute after, we were quietly watching a regular, good street fight. 4 or 5 sailors, half a dozen Irish labourers, and 5 or 6 women were having a lively time of it. Men and women indiscriminately fighting, kicking, biting, tearing out one another's hair by handful, shouting, yelling, cursing, and using the most filthy imprecations. Odd bits of garbage, stones, and brickbats were flying in all directions, and in the thick of the fight were 2 unfortunate officers who were using their clubs pretty freely, though not unnecessarily so. A powerfully built, muscular she-devil. She would have done for one of Bulwer's female gladiators in The Last Days of Pompeii. had got an unhappy man's head in chancery, and was administering some fearful blows with a large iron cooking ladle. The man's wife had the fingers of both hands wound in the assailant's hair, and clung to her with the tenacity of a bulldog. One of the Irishmen had a sailor on the ground. With one hand he clutched the poor fellow's hair, and repeatedly dashed his head on the pavement. His other hand was firmly gripped in the sailor's teeth. This scene went on for a minute or two, when suddenly, without a moment's warning, all simultaneously commenced a furious onslaught on the policemen, to whose assistance, at the risk of broken heads, we were on the point of going, when, fortunately for us, a posse of police arrived, and at once the fight was over, the battle done. The combatants were all marched off to the station house, a long file of bleeding heads and disfigured faces, all indignantly remonstrating against being taken into custody for so innocent an amusement as the breaking of one another's heads. Returning into Water Street, we entered one of the notorious sailors' dance houses, a dirty, dingy, miserable-looking place, though brilliantly lighted. At the inevitable bar stood 8 or 10 men, whose physiognomy at once told us they were thieves. The air of suspicion with which they viewed us, and their evident discomfort, as long as I and the detective remained in the place, confirmed this impression. Passing into the dancing room, which is separated from the bar by a partition, we found ourselves in a motley assemblage, composed of 2 or 3 sailors, a few canal men, 8 or 10 slangy-looking lads from 14 to 20 years of age, a select assortment of jailbirds, a candy and apple seller, and about a dozen of the fattest, coarsest, most brutal-looking women, with one solitary, scraggy one, dressed as ballet girls. These women, who were of all ages, from 25 to 40, the greater part of them old, were grandly parading about, or fondling their unlucky admirers on the benches which ran round the walls. Their costume was of the slightest description possible, a dress which, taking the waistband as a starting point, reached about halfway to the knees and halfway to the shoulders, made of cotton or some similar material, and of a brilliant colour, a few tawdry glass beads strung round the neck, a gaudily embroidered Scotch bonnet ornamented with feathers, tinselled flowers, and other gewgaws, a pair of dirty white or tartan stockings, and Broadway boots with very high heels, comprised all the toilet of which they boasted. I ventured to remark to the proprietor of the place that their dresses were rather scant, adding as a scapegoat for such a cold night. "Oh, they've got enough for the purposes of decency," he replied. Poor decency! How she would blush to hear her name mentioned in such a den. Of course, smoking, chewing, and bad whisky were in full force. The proprietor, who was also bandmaster, then took his seat in the little orchestra, which comprised a violin, a banjo, and a tambourine, and calling out, "Now, young ladies, a quadrille, if you please," led off a few bars of prelude. The quadrille was gone through, with a good many airs and graces on the part of the ladies, and a good deal of ludicrous buffoonery on the part of the men. The quadrille was followed by a series of Irish jigs, and then by the polka. However amusing it may be personally, it is certainly an ungraceful exhibition to see 2 drunken sailors pirouetting together, or 2 men waltzing with one woman. Sailors, however, do not much affect round dances. They prefer the shuffles. Their awkward sea-legged strides are scarcely suitable to the polka or the waltz, though happily the ladies' dresses are not long enough to run the risk of being trodden on. One sailor, who stood up near us, facetiously asked his partner why she didn't wear straps, and then slapping on the shoulder the solitary scraggy-looking one, who had very long thin legs, in a way that aroused her modest indignation, addressed her as Old Number 11. Our detective here called up one of the girls, whose manner and language perfectly astonished me. She said she had been there 7 years, that she was a girl of good family, and very well educated, that her mother was a widow lady of independent means, and resided in Scotland. She told us that she got into trouble when young, and was obliged to run away from home to hide her disgrace. She added, Thank God my poor mother knows nothing about me. It would kill her if she did. She believes me to be dead. Ah, sir, you do not know what a number of girls in this neighbourhood are well educated and of good family. There are many that can speak 2 or 3 languages, who could at one time play beautifully upon the harp and piano and sing operatic music, but having once got into this mode of life, they cannot shake it off. There's many and many a girl in these houses whose parents live in style uptown. The next place we entered was a boarding as well as a dance house. The bar and dancing arrangements are pretty much alike in all of them. In this house the landlord came forward and expressed the great pleasure it would give him to show us the sleeping rooms, the internal arrangements of which he assured us were elegant in the extreme. They were ranged round the sides of a square room, into which all the doors opened, and gave us the idea of a good-sized prison cell. Though necessarily very badly ventilated, they were well whitewashed, and the bedding and linen really looked clean and nice. For the use of one of these charming little apartments, as the landlord termed them, the charge is $3, but this sum includes breakfast in the morning and sundry other privileges. In the next house we visited, the proprietor came up to us and with a jaunty air asked us if we would like to see Punch and Judy. The drama of Punch and Judy, as now exhibited in the streets, is a sad enough degeneration from its original, the sacred play of Punch's Cam Judaeus of the Dark Ages. But this particular form of it was unusually vulgar and degraded, and I should hope peculiar to this place. The faithless Mr. Punch was supposed to have been dragged into the divorce courts by the exasperated Judy, and a mock trial took place. The whole exhibition was of the most disgusting and filthy description. We entered house after house of this character in Cherry, James, and Water Streets, but there is very little difference in them. They are all equally low and brutal. We counted no fewer than 27 sailors' retreats, as they are called, in Water Street alone. We also visited some of the bucket shops, which are everywhere to be found in the 4th Ward. At the bucket shop, a man gets a tumbler or bucket of stuff containing every fiery stimulant, but whiskey, though whiskey it is professed to be, for 5 cents. Its inflammatory influences soon produce the most intense thirst, and the poor fellows drink till they get into a state of beastly intoxication, when they are remorselessly turned out into the gutter. John Allen, once the most notorious sailors' dance-house keeper in the ward, is now out of the business, and the lower part of his old house is used as a mission house. He has become very dogged, sullen, and silent. He is disappointed with the turn affairs have taken, and is angry with himself and with all his neighbours. His old business has been entirely ruined, partly by exposure and partly by his attempt to play off the missionary by his pretended conversion. Between these 2 stools, John Allen's dance house has fallen to the ground. He is said, however, to have saved a great deal of money out of his infamous business, quite enough to keep him very comfortably for the remainder of his days. He is a tall, powerfully built man, about 35 years of age, but with a hangdog, brutal cast of countenance. He was unable to ask us into his house, as his wife was drunk, and when in that condition she is always very quarrelsome. Everyone in the street abuses John Allen, and expresses a pious wish that he may go to the devil as soon as possible, or anywhere else, so long as he takes himself off, so said Mr. Tommy Haddon. They seem to think that as long as the wickedest man in New York remains among them, so long will the agitation against their infamous mode of earning a living continue, but that, if Allen could be got out of the way, the outcry against them would soon cease. Allen, without intending to do so, has certainly done more to injure the business of these sailors' retreats than all the missionaries put together. He has, fortunately for the poor sailors, opened their eyes to the frauds practised upon them, taught them to be more careful of their own interests, and made them more shy than formerly of going to these places. His neighbours feel this, and they bless him accordingly. But in spite of the indirect aid thus rendered by Allen, I do not gather that the missionaries have met with that bountiful harvest which so heavy a crop of sinners warranted them in anticipating. I think their imperfect success is simply due to one great and all-important oversight. They try to Christianize before they have humanized those whom they desire to draw under their influence. This results in two ways. They either repel or they manufacture hypocrites. Their real penitents are few and far between. They go too much on the sudden call system, the trumpet call to repentance, and seem to think that it is perfectly natural that men and women can, under an impulse of suddenly awakened conscience, kneel down and pray to God, a being of whom they absolutely know nothing as to his powers, attributes, mercy, and justice. I went one day to one of these missionary prayer meetings, not in any carping spirit, and what I saw and heard there continued me in my previously conceived impressions of their futility as at present carried on. The meeting was composed of some 15 or 20 grey-haired and bald-headed gentlemen, a few young women of the stereotyped Water Street class, with a mass of chignon or plaited hair, outrageously greased for the occasion. These were said to be penitents. Some few very ragged-looking of the older victims of whiskey, with heavy shawls over their heads, about an equal number of men of the same stamp, and some dozen nondescript victims of curiosity, who sat in the back rows of seats, or stood near the entrance door. Those notorieties of Water Street, John Allen, Tommy Haddon, and jovial old Kit Byrne, were conspicuous by their absence. When I entered, the meeting was specially engaged in considering the case of a sailor who had put in an appearance, under the idea that the mission house was a place where he could sign the temperance pledge before starting on his voyage. But prayers, not pledges, were the order of the day. One of the speakers informed the unlucky sailor of this fact, called him a wicked sinner, probably only too true, and many other unpleasant names, and concluded by inviting the meeting to pray for this would-be penitent marine limb of Satan. This, however, was more than the sailor was prepared to stand. He soon showed signs of hauling in his cable, and, making full sail for the door, he endeavoured to cut and run, but these missionary gentlemen were not inclined to be balked of such an opportunity, and the sailor was compelled to remain while a holy-minded brother offered up on his behalf what a subsequent speaker characterized as his dear brother's most beautiful prayer. The groans of saintly agony which the dear brother interpolated between every few words, coursed as they were by the meeting, prevented my catching much of his supplication, but I was considerably struck on hearing him address the Saviour as "Sweet Sir." The effect of his fervid eloquence, too, was greatly marred by the frequent "O Lors" and "Anians," which came from all parts of the room, I presume by way of applause, without any apparent concert. The sailor was at last allowed to depart, when the chief prayer-master arose and requested any fellow sinners who may specially desire to be prayed for to stand up. But, he added, before this exhibition takes place, I would like to say a few words. The pious gentleman said his few words. The fellow sinners were duly prayed for amid many groanings and much general agitation and palpitation of smitten bosoms. The doxology was most inharmoniously dirged, and the meeting was over. Now, it is asserted in Water Street that every penitent who attends these prayer meetings receives so much for so doing, and that they invariably spend the money in rum. I certainly saw some of them go straight from the mission house to the liquor saloons. Would it not be better, then, to spend the same amount of money in erecting sailors' homes, working men's clubs, and Magdalen institutions? These missionaries are actuated by the best of intentions, but they make the fatal mistake of supposing that poor humanity can be as easily transplanted as a pear tree, or quietly repotted like a scarlet geranium. But to return to my explorations of the purlieus of Water Street after dark. Wandering along Water Street, the detective turned the handle of the door of a small liquor store, saying, "We'll just look in here a moment, sir." We accordingly walked in. Its only occupants were the proprietor, who was sitting fast asleep by the stove, and a small boy, By dint of much shaking, the small boy managed to awaken his master, saying, "Gentlemen, sir, gentlemen." The master quickly roused himself, and I was somewhat formally introduced to Christopher Byrne of the Sportsman's Hall. "And so this portly, jovial, pock-marked, sodden-faced-looking man is Kit Byrne, of whom we have lately heard so much," I muttered to myself. Mr. Byrne honoured me with a shake of his hand, and in answer to inquiries after his health, replied that he was "nicely, thank you, sir," and immediately added, "What will you take, gentlemen?" The detective suggested a glass of ale, and a glass of ale was drawn. Mr. Byrne was politeness itself, but very severe on "them parsons." "Going the round, eh, sir? Well, I'm very glad you ain't got no parsons with you. I'm full again them parsons, sir. Somehow I don't find parson sauce a good relish to a rare beefsteak. Slippery, sir, very." And Mr. Byrne emphatically shrugged his shoulders. "Downy lot, sir, very." And Mr. Byrne winked his eye. "Lord love you, sir, they like a glass with a stick in it every bit as much as you or I do." And Mr. Byrne looked contemptuous. "But I never throws a chance away, sir, so I says to the parson, says I, 'Gentlemen, where's the rhino?' 'Cash.' 'Let's finger the bills. No money, no prayers, gentlemen.' That's what I says. Well, sir, they paid me a whole month's rent in advance, but they only used the pit a fortnight. But then, you see, sir, that's their business, not mine." Here Mr. Byrne could scarcely control his merriment, but it gradually subsided in a series of chuckles. Mr. Byrne does not like John Allen and Tommy Hatton. He declared his opinion that they were both "reg'lar bad uns." "You see, sir," said he, "they thoroughly sweat a poor man, and make believe they don't. Well now, sir, maybe I sell a man a drink of bad whiskey, but then he knows that when he buys it. So that's fair and straight business, ain't it, gentlemen?" Mr. Byrne then politely offered to escort us to the pit, where there was "a leetle pup of 5 months," as Mr. Byrne termed a rough, sandy-haired terrier, playing with a rat. "He's only a learner, gentlemen," he remarked in an apologetic tone, "but he'll kill in a week. I do believe he will." How fondly Mr. Byrne gazed on that "leetle pup." How he eyed him with the air of a connoisseur. He then called our attention to the tiers of seats for the spectators of rat and canine contests, which he informed us would accommodate 500 persons, though we were at a loss to conceive how the unlucky occupants of the top row could possibly sit there, the seat being only about 30 inches from the roof. He knew, he said, that 475 gents were present when the Black and Tan, now stuffed and ornamenting the window, killed 300 under the hour, sir. And, with a look of pride, Mr. Byrne added, "And he did it easy, sir." But the thought of past scenes and days gone by, never to return, rendered the portly Mr. Byrne pathetic. "Ah, sir," he sighed, "them days is gone. My kind friend Mr. Burke has ruined my business. But they are varmint, and nobody can persuade me they're not." At the bare idea of rats not being vermin, Mr. Byrne became greatly excited. "But they are varmint," he repeated, "and Mr. Berg knows it, too. And what's more, he won't try the law. Why? Because he knows he'd be beat, sir. That's why. But it ain't no use me a-talking, sir. I only lose my temper. But I can't a-bear to see people a-meddling with what they don't understand." Mr. Byrne very kindly offered to turn off a dozen or two, for our amusement, at 10 cents apiece, gentlemen. But this we politely declined. He insisted, however, on our taking another glass of ale, for which having paid, I wished Mr. Byrne good evening, again had the honour of shaking hands with him, and took my leave, he giving me a most pressing invitation to step in and see me again. Kit Byrne is certainly an original character. That his business is a disreputable one no one will attempt to deny, and that his views of Christianity may not be all that the missionaries could wish, may be an equally self-evident proposition. Still, Byrne is a good neighbour and a kind friend, and he will not allow thieves and cracksmen a chance in his house, but turns them out at once. He ought not, then, to be placed in the same category as such men as John Allen and Tommy Hatton, for, as he himself expressed it to me, cruelty to varmint, if it is cruelty, sir, surely ain't the same as the cruelty to humans carried on up the street, sir. But because I think rats is varmint, sir, and the parsons don't, they pray for me every day at the meeting house at 12 o'clock, but not by name, sir. Now, poor Kit Burns comes in the general catalogue of wicked, unrepentant sinners." Mr. Burns' face, as he gave vent to this piece of irony, was a study for a painter, and his little round eyes fairly danced with delight as he recounted to us how near he come to getting one on them tight once. Arthur Pember continued on a dangerous journey along Water Street well into the night. Be sure to return to find out what he uncovered in New York after dark.